Howdy, 7th grade. Today we're going to be talking about how to simplify some square roots. So I know square roots are something we've been struggling with a little bit because we haven't seen them too much, but today we're going to learn how to work with them a little bit, get our hands dirty with them. Should be really good at kind of getting our intuition right with how a square root works. So you'll know what a square root is if I have a number like 9, I could write it as 3 squared or 3 times 3. So what I can say then is the square root of 9 equals 3, and what that means is that 3 times itself would be 9. So that is what a square root is, and today we're going to be looking a little bit at how to simplify them. So sometimes we get these giant square roots that are going to be really, really obnoxious and kind of hard to work with, and we're going to have to still work with them. But we don't want to keep them as giant square roots because that's no fun at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called the product property of square roots. What the product property is, I'm going to write it using I can't write product. The product property, I'm going to write it using the most algebraic way possible, which means it's going to be all with letters. But what it says is the square root of a times b equals the square root of a times the square root of b. And what this means is multiplying things inside a square root is the same as multiplying things outside the square root. So a couple things that I want to note real quick. Going back to our example up here with square root of 9 equals 3. If the square root of 9 equals 3, that means the square root of 9 times the square root of 9 equals 9. And I can say this about any number. So I could say the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 equals 5. Or more generally, I could say the square root of a times the square root of a equals a. And this is kind of how we define a square root. This right here is its definition. So this is what we're going to be going with. This and the product property are going to help us really simplify these things so that they're a little easier to work with. So what I'm going to want to do is I am going to want to take a big square root and try to simplify it, because I think that the best way to do this is just kind of by seeing an example done. So the first example I'm going to want to do is going to be the square root of 12. And the square root of 12 is not too bad. It's not too huge of a number, but what we're going to want to do is I can say that the square root of 12 is the same thing as two numbers that multiply to 12 multiplied together. So to do that, I'm going to have to find a factor tree. So our first step is going to be to factor. I'm going to go to 3 and 4, and 4 is going to be 2 and 2. So my first step is going to be to factor. So now I can say that the square root of 12 is going to be equal to the square root of 3 times 2 times 2. And I know that because I factored my 12. So the second thing I'm going to want to do is to split my root, which sounds like something very painful that they would do in a dentist's office, but instead it's something pretty easy we do in math. So from this root 3 times 2 times 2, I'm actually going to get a root 3 times root 2 times root 2. So all I did here was my 3 got its own square root, my 2 got its own square root, and my 2 got its own square root. Now that we've done that, I know that the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the same thing as 2. So these things are going to go away, and I'm going to have a 2, and this is going to give me root 3 times 2. And because this square root thing has a weird end, it's really nice to put the whole numbers that aren't under a root in front. So we're going to write this as 2 root 3, and that's the same as the square root of 12 we started with. So our answer is going to be this 2 square root of 3. So my third step there was to recombine. And one more time, my 3 steps, just to make sure we see them, was the first was to factor. So I got a factor tree out, and I broke my number up, after which I split my root. So I gave all the numbers that I factored their own little square root symbol, their radical, and then I recombined it. And when I recombined it, I was able to simplify it into this simpler form right here, the 2 root 3. So we're going to try doing this again with a slightly larger number, and I'm going to try the square root of 600. So my first step, of course, is going to be to factor, which we just talked about, and I see that this ends in a 0, so it'll be pretty easy to do 10 times 60. 10 is 5 and 2. And 60, I can break into 10 and 6. 10 will go to 5 and 2, and 6 will go to 3 and 2. So that's my first step, which is factoring. So I can rewrite this square root, it's going to be a little long, as 5 times 2 times 5 times 2 times 3 times 2. And that's how I factor this 600 into all of its prime factors. So now I'm going to separate my roots out. So this is going to be square root of 5 times root 2 times root 5 times root 2 times root 3 times root 2. Which is kind of obnoxious just because there's so many numbers, but I promise most of yours will have smaller numbers than 600. And once we're done with that, we're going to try to recombine these as best we can. So I know that the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is just going to be 5. And the square root of 2 and the square root of 2 is going to give me 2. I'm left with this square root of 3 and the square root of 2. So going through this, 5 times 2 is going to be 10, times my square root of 3 times the square root of 2. But if I remember, this is going to be the same thing as square root of 3 times 2. It's the same outside the radical as inside. So once I'm done with that, I can just combine those, and I end up with 10. Root 6 is the same thing as the root 600 that I started with. And that is all we're doing today. So I encourage you guys to go through that lesson practice, get that done, and I will see y'all in class tomorrow. Have a great day.